Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on March 28, 2025. Now to today. Our speaker today is Scott Boyd. He's a longtime member and former president of the Fredericksburg Civil War Roundtable. He's a Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude graduate of Mary Washington College, before it was a university, right? He majored in computer science and worked as a Navy civilian computer scientist at the Naval Warfare Center down the road in Dahlgren. After he retired, Mr. Boyd began freelance writing, focusing his work on his longtime interest in Civil War naval history. So, this ties right in, does it not? This led to him becoming a reporter for 11 years for the monthly newspaper Civil War News. The Fredericksburg Freelance Star published several of Mr. Boyd's articles on the Hunley, most notably a front page article on March 20, 2004, announcing that one of the crewmen recovered from the Hunley had been identified as being from Fredericksburg, scooping the Washington Post by one day. Yay. No mean feat for a tiny paper like our hometown one, Freelance Star. One of Mr. Boyd's topics will be some surprising new information on the Fredericksburg connection to the Hunley. So this is what you've all been waiting for and what you all came for. So Scott, if you'd take over.
The day, 17 February 1864, 161 years ago last month. The time, approximately 6 p.m. The place, Breach Inlet, on the north end of Sullivan's Island, just outside the mouth of Charleston Harbor. A small, strange, tubular-shaped vessel, 40 feet long, is tied up at the pier. Her crew of 8 slide down into the craft and close the 2 narrow hatches behind them. Soon the vessel is headed out into the cold waters of the Atlantic. Its triple-bladed propeller, powered by a single hand crank, turned by 7 of the 8 crewmen. Her prey? The wooden screw sloop USS Housatonic, 207 feet long, 1,240 tons displacement with 10 guns, commanded by Captain Charles Pickering, U.S. Navy. The Housatonic is on blockade duty, anchored in shallow water off Sullivan's Island, 5.5 miles east-southeast from Fort Sumter, and about 4 miles from Breach Inlet. Lookouts spot a strange object in the water off the starboard bow, slowly approaching the Housatonic. Within 1.5 miles of spotting it, they determine the object is hostile and sound the alarm. The crew is called to quarters. The cable slipped, freeing the ship from being anchored, and the engine backed. The men on watch open fire with small arms. The object is too close for the ship's guns to be brought to bear. Within 3 minutes of originally spotting the object, a torpedo with 135 pounds of black powder explodes. Under the Housatonic's waterline, she sinks immediately, her punctured hull resting on the bottom in 27 feet of water. Most of her crew clings to the rigging, which sticks up above the cold water. Only 5 men on the Housatonic die. The other 158 are rescued by nearby Union ships. However, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley doesn't return to base at Breach Inlet and is never heard from again until discovered on the ocean's floor in 1995 and raised in 2000 to be carefully preserved and studied here at the Warren Lash Conservation Center on the old Navy base in Charleston. As the interior of the submarine is excavated, the remains of the crew are recovered, and these are buried in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery on the 17th of April in 2004. Predecessors of the H.L. Hunley. The Hunley was the third in a series of submarines financed, designed, and built by the same group of businessmen and engineers. Here's Horace L. Hunley himself. He was not a military or naval officer. He was a businessman, a wealthy businessman and financier, an ardent Southern patriot who believed in the Southern cause. This is James McClintock. He was a mechanic. He was a man who built things. There was also a man named Watson who was his partner as a mechanic in building the submarines. This is the Pioneer, their first submarine, built in New Orleans, launched the 12th of March, 1862, 30 feet long, cylindrical with a diameter of 4 feet, tapered at both ends like a cigar, a two-man crew. Propulsion was a hand-crank propeller turned by one of the two men. The weapon was a torpedo. You see the box on the top with the two look like spear points. So the idea was to get underneath the target ship and detach that and stick it up underneath the hull of the target ship. The Pioneer was not just a submarine, it was also a privateer, believe it or not. Usually you think of privateers as, surface ships. Privateers are private warships that are given what's called a letter of marque by the government to authorize them to attack enemy civilian and military vessels on behalf of the government. The people that own the privateer are then given financial rewards for doing so. This submarine had a letter of marque. It was a privateer submarine. It was still being tested when New Orleans fell to Union Flag Officer Farragut's fleet on the 25th of April, 1862. The builders of the Pioneer scuttled it and fled to Mobile. This was the building they used in Mobile to work on their next submarine. This was a picture taken around 1960. It was still standing then. Now we're going to talk about the next submarine, the American Diver, sometimes known as Pioneer 2. This was launched in early 1863. 36 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet tall, tapered at each end, a 5-man crew. The original propulsion was to be an electromagnetic motor. Think about that. Here we are in the early 1860s, an electromagnetic motor. That's astounding. That's like Jules Verne. So they had quite an imagination, these mechanics, these engineers who were putting this together. That was their vision for how this was going to be propelled, but they just didn't have the means to make that part become a reality. So they had to fall back on what they knew worked, which was the hand-cranked propeller. The weapon was a towed torpedo. Instead of the torpedo, you go under and stick it up. The towed torpedo. This means the torpedo, the charge was in like a barrel, in effect, towed behind it on a rope, a long rope. The idea was to go under the enemy vessel with this towed behind you. You go under it and you just pull it right into the enemy vessel. That was the concept for the towed torpedo. The American diver sank with no loss of life on Valentine's Day, 1863, while being towed to Fort Morgan in Mobile. Now, a small digression. The CSS David. The David was a semi-submersible, not a submarine. This was what you might call a very primitive torpedo boat. You can see the smokestack. This was a steam-powered vessel. It had an open cockpit. You can see that on top. Just a two-bladed propeller. Its torpedo was at the end of a spar at the front of the vessel. So the men operating it would be sitting in the open cockpit, very low in the water. That was its stealth factor, you might say. But it's got the smokestack sticking up, so, the enemy's going to probably see that coming towards them. Here's a model, really gives you an idea, especially when you can see the scale models of the crewmen. This was its target. It was built in South Carolina, considerably far inland. Its target was the Union's largest ironclad at the time, which was the armored steam frigate USS New Ironsides. Most of the Union ironclads were monitors in the Charleston area. This was a steam frigate, the New Ironsides. This was going to be the target for the David. The David's biggest claim to fame was its attack on October 5th, 1863, on the New Ironsides. Through surprise, the Yankees weren't expecting it. They got up close. They detonated the spar torpedo. They scored a hit. They inflicted some serious damage on the New Ironsides. Unfortunately for the men operating the David, the splashback extinguished the steam engine on the David, so they couldn't make a clean escape. So they had their success. They damaged the enemy vessel they were attacking, but they couldn't steam away. So their ship was drifting. At this point, the sailors on the New Ironsides, were aware something had happened. They'd been attacked, so they opened fire with small arms. So the Confederates jumped off. The small crew jumped off, were trying to swim away. But a couple of the men stayed close to the David. And as it was drifting away, they were able to reignite the steam engine and get it going again. And they were able to get back to base. It was quite an adventure for those guys. And here's a picture. The David survived till the end of the war. After the war, here's the David abandoned in Charleston. But besides being another example of Confederate ingenuity and determination, to break the blockade at Charleston, I wanted to introduce the David because she plays a role later in the story of the Hunley. The digression has a purpose. Now, the H.L. Hunley is built in Mobile. Remember that building I showed you, where they do the mechanical work? Here is a laser scan of the recovered Hunley. Quite beautiful. The Hunley was named after Horace Lawson Hunley, the financier. It was launched early July, 1863, made from a 25-foot boiler cut lengthwise, with a 12-inch strip added to make it wider, tapered ends, added fore and aft to bring the length to approximately 40 feet, not counting the rudder, an 8-man crew, propulsion by a, let's say it together now, hand-cranked propeller. That's just how it had to be back then. Okay, now these are some really interesting comparison slides here. Relative scale. If we have any Navy men here, particularly men who served, let's say all the way up to the 1980s or 90s, you might be familiar. So there's a Los Angeles class nuclear attack sub on the top, 360 feet long. And there's a Ben Franklin class boomer sub carrying nuclear ballistic missiles on the bottom, 425 feet, nuclear propelled subs. And there's little old Hunley, 40 feet long. So gives you an idea of the scale. But just think about that, 1864 versus 1970s, 1980s. Look how far we've come in such a short time. It's incredible. Human ingenuity. Now here's a diagram showing some of the features and aspects of the Hunley. So we see the rudder, propeller, the keel weights on the bottom. They were removable from the inside. They had wing nut type screws. The guys had a wrench they could use. So if they were in some kind of dire trouble and needed to float to the surface, they could release the keel weights. That was a safety measure. You have the two conning towers with the access hatches. Those were very narrow. I'm a hefty guy. I would never fit in there. You had to be skinny to get into the Hunley. Skinny. Like 18 inches skinny to fit into that thing. You know. Deadlights on the top to let natural light in. The captain at the bow, he had a candle to help him see, to read charts, to help him see the very few gauges he had, like a compass. There's a cutwater, as you see the slanted thing, the cutwater at the front of both of the conning towers. You see the top snorkels. They did have snorkels, but they were not effective. Again, that was something they were conceiving of as a good thing to have. They were kind of thinking ahead. They had the right idea, but just the technology, they just couldn't quite make them effective. See the dive planes on the side, those certainly worked. Now inside the Hunley. So look at 1 and 12. Those are the forward and aft ballast tanks. Again, you see the thing hanging at the bottom. That's the keel. The first officer position at the rear, that's the guy there. He would operate the rear ballast tank. The captain operating you can see him bent on his knees at the front, operating the forward ballast tank. Captain also would be able to look up through the forward conning tower. The first officer in the rear, besides operating the rear ballast tank, he also did have a hand crank position. The captain did not operate a hand crank. She had 7 men operating the hand crank propeller. What's called the bellows equipment, that's for like the snorkel. Now this is really interesting. This is a side cutaway view. Look how cramped the men are. See, there's a bench here on the side where the guys are sitting. Hunched over, there's the crank. So you're hunched over and doing this. They are really cramped. That is, you've got to be some kind of dedicated to be willing to get into that thing for 6-8 hours. Just imagine what that was like. Of course, it goes without saying that these men were all volunteers. Nobody was forcing anybody to get into that vessel. But that was got to have been quite an experience. Another cutaway looking at the 2 ballast tanks. It did have pumps that could be operated if there was any leakage, and also pumps to pump the ballast out to help raise the ship up, raise the boat up. Ships are on the surface, submarines are boats. Can't forget my Navy lingo. Okay. Now the weapon system for the Hunley. Already mentioned, this is a diagram of what I was talking about with the towed torpedo. That was the initial way it was done. And this was the final configuration, the torpedo on a spar. And it actually had 2 spars. It had the long spar with the torpedo, the long spar at the bottom. And at the top there was a short spar to help prop it up, as you can see there, help support it. Okay. Now we're going to talk about basing that it was built in Charleston. Now we're going to talk about basing it in Charleston. It was sent to Charleston, arriving on the 12th of August, 1863. The original crew from Mobile made 3 unsuccessful attempts to attack blockaders. Let me see if I can get this pointer thing. Bingo. There's Fort Sumter. This is the crucial point here in the harbor. You kind of reference everything else. Here's Fort Moultrie over here, the main shipping channel. There's Charleston, Battery Point down there, Castle Pinckney here. And initially it was based over here, kind of behind Fort Johnson. The original crew from Mobile made 3 unsuccessful attempts to attack blockaders. Here comes the David. One of the schemes involved having the steam-powered CSS David tow the Hunley past Fort Sumter and then cut it loose. And then the Hunley guys would take over with their hand crank and crank the rest of the way out towards the Union blockaders to make their attack. At this point, the Hunley was still using a towed torpedo, which nearly struck the David, nearly causing an utter catastrophe. Dissatisfied with the lack of results, General Beauregard, who was in charge of the overall Charleston defenses, seized the sub on the 26th of August, 1863. And at this point, the sub was still privately owned. He determined the sub's owners were owed $27,500 by the Confederate government and made sure they were paid. And now with the sub in his possession, Beauregard had local Confederate Navy officials put together a crew of volunteers, of course, to operate the sub. I think you can maybe get some impressions from what you're looking at there. August 29th, 1863, the first Hunley crew is lost when during training exercises in the harbor, the submarine is flooded and sinks, killing over half the crew. This is in Magnolia Cemetery. An interesting point here is this man, Absalom Williams. He was a black man, and he was in the crew. I believe he was a free, what was called a free man of color. So he wasn't a slave. I believe he was a free man of color. But that was an interesting point. But these 5 crewmen, over half the crew, they were lost. This was the first Hunley crew lost. Not to enemy action, but this was a training accident. Beauregard has the sub raised, the 5 bodies inside buried, and the vessel cleaned up for further operations. The namesake of the sub, Horace Hunley, asks General Beauregard for permission to select a crew and command the sub. Remember what I said about Horace Hunley's qualifications? He's a rich man, a financier, Southern patriot. What did I say about him? Naval officer, military officer. Beauregard agrees. Here rests the crew of Confederate submarine Hunley. This October 15th, 1863, the second Hunley crew is lost when the vessel is swamped and sinks during a training cruise in the harbor, killing all 8 men, including Horace Hunley. 3 weeks later, on November 5th, 1863, Beauregard writes that the sub is too dangerous to operate. So far, it has killed 13 Confederates and no Yankees. At this point, Army Lieutenant Dixon, who was involved with the sub's design and construction in Mobile, convinces Beauregard to let him try to sink Union vessels with the sub. And by 14 November 1863 was given command of the Hunley. Beauregard put some stipulations. He insisted that the Hunley discard the towed torpedo and instead use a spar torpedo. So, here's Fort Johnson, where the Hunley had been based. Here is Battery Marshall over on Sullivan's Island, and Breach Inlet. This is going to be the new home of the Hunley, where Lieutenant Dixon is going to have it based. This is a good slide, just giving you an idea of how the Federal ships on blockade were stationed. You had the monitors, the ironclads, in close. Then you had other ships here in the main channel, and then you had ships outside the Charleston bar. They had a lot of ships here on the blockade. And of course, the Confederates had Charleston very heavily fortified. And this is a close-up dock here, breach inlet. The H.L. Hunley attacks its prey. Here we go. The Hunley comes out. This is on February 17th, 1864. And there is the Housatonic. Okay, let's get into some of the interesting details about this attack. This attack is the one that made history, being the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship in combat. So the Hunley comes out, has its point of attack, the stern quarter of the Housatonic. These are named crewmen from the reports, and you'll find it in the official records. Named crewmen who were firing their small arms at the Hunley as it was making its approach. This is a photograph of a sister ship of the Housatonic. You can see the approximate point of attack there. Here we go. So we have the water line, the 8-foot depth mark, that's where that torpedo was hanging down, way below the water line of the Housatonic. And very possibly at the gun cotton room, which should have been a very sensitive area to have a detonation. Boom! And much has been made about alleged sightings of a blue light, but the reports are very inconsistent, and it's not at all clear that a blue light was ever actually sighted. It makes for a good story, a good novel. One of the things that surprised a lot of people was the position of the Hunley as discovered. It was on the seaward side of the Housatonic. A lot of people thought it was going to be over here. Whoops, excuse me. A lot of people thought it was going to be over here towards the landward side. It was on the seaward side. That's one of the things when people were searching for it, threw them off. Let's talk about the damage that was actually found on the Hunley to give us a clue about what happened to it exactly, because that's the mystery that continues to this day. Why didn't the Hunley return? This is the real Hunley. This is the scan. The blue represents holes in the hull of the Hunley. The forward conning tower has a breach up here. Hull has some breaches. You have to understand the Hunley was underwater for, approximately 140 years. So seawater. Hunley made out of iron, a lot of corrosion, seawater, moving back and forth. You got all these factors. So corrosion has to be taken into account. One of the things that was repeatedly examined and discussed with this forward conning tower breach was, was it shot out by the small arms fire? Is that what sank the Hunley? And it's just not convincing at all. They didn't find, broken glass inside the Hunley. That explanation just doesn't hold up. And this, for instance, looks more like possible damage from much later. So
They just don't see the kind of damage that looks like it came from the night of the attack. Damage on the hull of the Hunley. The red blotches are holes in the hull of the Hunley. The solid black blotches on either end are things that were cast iron, not the boiler pieces that were put together to make the hull of the Hunley. These were cast iron pieces at either end for sturdiness in the way it was constructed. You can only call it a defect in the construction. It is the bulkheads on the ballast tanks, they didn't go all the way up. They were open. So if the Hunley tilted too much, water could spill out into the crew compartment. When you hear that, don't you just kind of shake your head and say, what were they thinking? You know, but it did have a pump to pump out water that got into the crew compartment. But that's something that's just hard to understand in the design of the Hunley. Maybe they just didn't think it would come to that, of the vessel being upset that much. But so, what happened? Were there poor tidal conditions and weather? Well, this was in February, but the poor tidal conditions and weather don't account for what happened to the Hunley. Was there a collision with the ship? We don't see that in the damage. The holes in the Hunley don't comport with that. Battle damage traps the crew. No. You got to hear some other things. They're going to come up here in a moment. Something else. Let's look at the conditions inside the Hunley. This is very, very telling. The crewmen were found, remember all 8, they were found seated at their stations. Seated at their stations. If there was some kind of emergency, if there was a hull breach, you know, if one of the conning towers had been smashed, don't you think those 8 men in that terribly cramped thing would have gotten out of their seats, been fighting each other to get out? Let me push that hatch up. Let me get out of this thing. We're going to die, man. They were seated peacefully at their stations. And in the bodies of the crewmen, there were no broken bones or obvious trauma. So it's not like the Hunley had been just given some awful, terrible shake that shaken enough to break human bones. No scramble to escape the sub. And the pumps, this took them a long time to be able to say. The people of the conservation had a long time to be able to make this statement, because they had to get all the concretion off the pump handles and the cocks, sea cocks and so forth. But they were able to say the pumps were not set to pump out water. And remember, we talked about the keel weights. They were not released. So the men were not acting, the crewmen were not behaving like there was some kind of emergency. So you just kind of furrow your brow and say, what was going on? What can't be seen that could account for this? Are you ready? Internal trauma, specifically air blast trauma, destroying their lungs. They died fairly instantly. That's why they were seated peacefully. That's why they weren't scrambling. In a way, it was kind of a blessing to die that way and not be alive long enough to realize you were in a sinking ship and you were in a dire emergency. You were going to die in a matter of a minute or two. They were just poof, this horrible instant trauma and lights out. Rachel Lance. This is the book I highly recommend. She was a doctoral student at Duke University. Biomedical engineering. And this sort of thing was exactly her specialty. And it was a new thing for her to be looking at something sort of as specialized and unusual as a Civil War submarine. She was more used to looking at modern day American soldiers in Afghanistan being in a tank or an APC or a Humvee going over an improvised explosive device, and that thing exploding and sending tremendous shock waves through the vehicle. And these guys are, in an armored vehicle, and the shock waves come up and do things to them. That's the sort of thing she was used to studying. And some of her studies were based on World War II studies done in Britain about men in then World War II submarines and depth charges and stuff, and what that could do to men in submarines. So she was able to apply some of that to the unique situation of a Civil War submarine. 8 men in this tiny 40-foot iron tube. And she came to the conclusion that it was the blast trauma that got them. So. Now, let me talk to you about the Fredericksburg connection. The president mentioned the article that I had published back in March 20th, 2004, talking about one of the Hunley crewmen having a Fredericksburg connection. 19 years later, in 2023, I submitted an article to the Freelance Star with a remarkable update, and for reasons that were not explained to me, the Freelance Star chose not to publish it. But I am happy to read the relevant portion here to you. On August 8th, 2023, a press release by Friends of the Hunley, that's the group that is the public face of the Hunley preservation effort in Charleston, announced that records were recently found that showed that Frank Collins of Fredericksburg had lived in a veterans home in Washington, D.C. long after the war had ended. This meant Collins could not have been in the crew of the Hunley that perished following the loss of the submarine after its attack sinking the USS Housatonic. Now on to my part of the article here. Research has uncovered U.S. Marine Corps muster rolls. U.S. Marines, not Confederate Marine Corps. U.S. Marine Corps muster rolls showing that Francis G. Collins was a career leatherneck, joining the Marines in October 1859, before the Civil War broke out. Even though his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union in April 1861, Collins followed the path of some fellow Southerners in uniform who stayed loyal to the Union. Collins spent the Civil War years serving at sea on the USS Saratoga, USS Potomac, and USS South Carolina, as well as time spent stationed on shore at the Marine Barracks in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. Collins continued to re-enlist in the Marine Corps, serving until his final discharge on September 20th, 1881. He was admitted to the Veterans Home on December 6, 1886, at age 50, and unmarried. He died on March 2nd, 1908, from cardiac disease. So Frank Collins, he was a U.S. Marine. He was not a Confederate sailor. And the Hunley folks in Charleston, they acknowledged that in their research they simply made a mistake, and they believed that one of the other crewmen named Lumpkin wasn't a Fredericksburg connection, but was a Virginia connection, and they believed that this Lumpkin fellow was from Southwest Virginia. So there is a Virginia connection to the Hunley, just not a Fredericksburg connection. And they will be posting more on that as time goes on. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? How did they transport the Hunley from Mobile to Charleston, rather?
Yeah.
Was it overland, or did they come via the water?
Oh no, it was on a train.
Okay.
Yeah, I used special car because it was a 40-foot thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could you describe the actual ignition mechanism for the torpedo? Did the captain pull a lanyard? Was there a percussion cap hammer? How did the actual ignition work?
Yeah. It was a percussion device. Yeah. Yeah, because it's something there's been a lot of speculation about, and in stories over time, things they've been changing versions of it. Some of it has been a lanyard version, but I believe the latest thinking is that it was a percussion device at the end of the torpedo, and because originally back 20 years ago when I started writing about the Hunley, the original thinking was it was sort of like almost like the stinger, like a wasp leaves, that it goes into you, sticks it in you, and then it flies away. So that was kind of the lanyard thing, was that the Hunley would stick it into the enemy ship, and then the Hunley would leave with the lanyard unrolling, unspooling. And when the lanyard reached the end, then it would detonate. But what actually happened was the explosion took place very close to the Hunley. There was no unspooling. It didn't detach from the Hunley. It was attached to the spar of the Hunley. The spar was attached to the Hunley. So the explosion took place very close to the Hunley. So it never detached.
What was the amount of explosive in the distance from the Hunley at the time of the explosion?
It was 135 pounds. Yeah.
And how far away was the Hunley at that point?
About 16 feet. Yeah.
How did the air blast get inside the Hunley?
It would have been through the water. Through the water. Concussion was through the water. Because the Hunley was on the surface, just slightly, mostly
It
submerged.
flexed the hull?
Pardon me?
It flexed the hull?
It certainly would have impacted the hull. Yeah.
was oxygen supply, adequate oxygen return.
Now, why'd you have to use the word adequate? That was always a bit of an issue. That's why they had this horrible thing. But that's why they had the hatches on the conning towers. I mean, that was always something they were keenly aware of, that oxygen was limited. They made all kinds of tests about how long we can survive with the submarine sealed up. They made tests of okay, let's all of us get in there, and then we're gonna go underwater, and we're gonna sit there, and let's get the old watch going, and let's see how long we can make it. They did things like that. It wasn't at all like like when you have modern submarines and the kind of oxygen machines and stuff. It was rough. Yeah.
I have a question about the time. Did the Hunley go ahead and did it attack at night or during the day?
Oh, no. Remember, 6 p.m. was the start time.
Okay.
So it was strictly a nighttime thing. That helped with the stealth factor of not being spotted. So yeah. Yeah.
They couldn't account for the hole in the forward conning tower. Did they rule out that it was shrapnel from the ship that they hit? I mean, they're only 16 feet away.
Well, I mean, it was a wooden ship.
Yep.
I think that the conclusion was that it was probably some post-battle damage. I think that was the likely conclusion.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.